Before pads, before tampons, and long before anyone could quietly grab a box from the drugstore, women still had to deal with the exact same problem every month. So what did they actually use? The honest answer is that we don't know every detail. Menstruation was rarely written about, and for a long time, historians barely treated menstrual products as objects worth preserving. Most solutions were made at home, used in private, and then simply disappeared. But a few clues survived, and some of them are a lot more inventive than you might expect. For thousands of years, the most common answer was probably the simplest one: cloth. Women could fold pieces of fabric into absorbent pads, wash them, and use them again. There was nothing glamorous about it, but it worked. In parts of Europe during the 1700s and 1800s, homemade pads were often made from woven fabric or flannel. Depending on where someone lived, other materials could be used too. Museum records describe moss and buffalo skin being used by some indigenous communities in North America. Ancient Greek women may have used lint wrapped around a small piece of wood as an early form of tampon. That sounds uncomfortable today, but people worked with what they had. And that is an important part of this story. There was no single solution. Most women used whatever was available, affordable, and practical where they lived. And in many cases, they may not have used anything at all. For much of history, free bleeding was simply part of life. Clothing was heavier. Laundry was difficult. And expectations surrounding hygiene were very different from what they are today. Then, in the late 1800s, companies started trying to sell disposable products. In 1896, Johnson & Johnson introduced something called Lister's towels. These were disposable sanitary napkins made from cotton and gauze. It sounded like progress, but there was a problem. Women were often too embarrassed to ask for them. Menstruation was still treated as something that should never be mentioned publicly. Even buying the product could feel awkward. Some advertisements were so vague. It wasn't always obvious what the product was actually for. And then there was another challenge: keeping the pad in place. Modern adhesive pads didn't exist yet. Instead, women often used something called a sanitary belt, an elastic belt worn around the waist, with clips at the front and back. A pad or folded towel would hang between them. They worked, but they weren't exactly comfortable. Sanitary belts remained common for decades. In fact, they didn't really begin disappearing until adhesive pads became available in the late 1960s. But one of the biggest changes in menstrual history happened because of something completely unrelated to periods: the First World War. During the war, medical workers needed bandages that could absorb large amounts of blood. One material developed for this purpose was cellucotton, a highly absorbent wood pulp product with a texture similar to cotton. After the war, the material found a very different use. In 1921, Kotex sanitary napkins were introduced using cellucotton wrapped in gauze. They were disposable, widely advertised, and far more successful than many earlier attempts. There was even a strange competitor made from sphagnum moss. Yes, moss. Sphagnum moss can absorb many times its own dry weight in liquid. It had already been used in surgical dressings. A company in the Pacific Northwest sold moss-filled sanitary pads under the name Sphagnikins. The products never became a major success. Kotex did. Tampons followed a little later. Versions of tampons had already been used in medicine for other purposes, including stopping bleeding from wounds and delivering medication. But the design most often connected to the modern commercial tampon came from a 1931 patent filed by Earl Haas. His version used a paper tube applicator. That design eventually became Tampax. By the late 1960s, adhesive pads finally began replacing the old belt systems. And over time, more options appeared. Menstrual cups, reusable pads, period underwear, and products designed for different levels of comfort and convenience. The history of menstrual products isn't just the history of an invention. It's also the history of a subject people were uncomfortable talking about. For generations, women managed periods using scraps of cloth, homemade solutions, and whatever materials were available around them. Then war, advertising, and changing attitudes slowly transformed a private monthly problem into an entire modern industry. And chances are, the next time you walk past a shelf full of modern products, you'll never look at it quite the same again. Subscribe for more stories from humanity's forgotten age.